In the previous video, we saw how property binding functionality can be achieved using interpolation. In this video, I will demonstrate a functionality that can be achieved with property binding but cannot be achieved using interpolation. This demonstration will help you understand the difference between property binding and interpolation. Let us say that I want to disable the second button dynamically based on component property. In app.component.ts, I am defining a property btn disabled with data type as Boolean. On a side note, Boolean is TypeScript specific data type. If btn disabled is true, then I want the button to be disabled. If btn disabled is false, then I want the button to be enabled. Now I am assigning btn disabled as true, which should disable the button. I am saving this file. Next, let us implement property binding based on this btn disabled property in app.component.html. Now in app.component.html, for the second input button, I am defining the disabled attribute within square brackets with value as btn disabled. If I save and check the page, we can see that the second button gets disabled. In app.component.ts, if I change btn disabled to false and saving the file, we can see that the button is now enabled. Using property binding, we have implemented the expected feature. Now let us try to implement the same functionality using interpolation. In app.component.html, I am creating a copy of the second button and including a third button. Let me convert the property binding to interpolation in the third button. I am removing the square brackets and changing the value with interpolation syntax. If we look into app.component.ts, the value of btn disabled is false. Hence, after saving app.component.html, we expect the second and third button to be enabled. Let us see what happens after saving. After saving, we can see that the second button is enabled, but the third button is disabled, which means that the third button with interpolation syntax is not working as expected. Let me try to explain this behavior. In Angular documentation, if we look into property binding section, we can see that the property binding modifies the DOM property and not the HTML attribute. Each tag in HTML has an associated object representation in DOM. For input element of type button, the respective object representation is HTML input element. This is the documentation from Wartwig, which currently maintains the standards for web technologies. This page contains the documentation of HTML input element. If I scroll down under the DOM interface section, we can see the properties of the HTML input element. Over here, we can see the disabled property, which is defined with type Boolean. In app.component.html, we defined disabled property within square brackets. It directly represents the disabled property and not the HTML attribute. This is what is defined in the Angular documentation, that the property binding modifies the DOM property. Once the DOM element property gets modified, the changes are immediately reflected in the browser. It is important that the data type defined in the documentation should match with the data type that we have defined in app.component.ts. That is the reason why I defined the data type as Boolean for btn disabled. We can see that this matches with the data type defined in the DOM HTML input element. Hope this explanation helps you to understand how property binding works. Next, we will look into interpolation and see why it did not work. Interpolation is string based. The value returned by the component gets converted into a string and it gets displayed as it is as a text in the web page. Hence, interpolation cannot be used to modify DOM element properties as the data types may change. This is the main difference between interpolation and property binding. In the interpolation example code here, once disabled attribute is included, irrespective of whatever value is assigned, the presence of this attribute is going to make the element disabled. Hence, the syntax always displays the element as disabled. Hope this explanation helps you understand the difference when using interpolation and property binding. In the next video, we will understand how property binding fits into Angular architecture.